The S&P 500 was down over 2% on Wednesday, July 24th. What happened? Let's take a look at the indexes and their performance on the day. If we take a look here, we can see that the S&P 500 was down over 2.3%, the Nasdaq down over 3.6%. That's a huge drop. We're going to talk about that. And if we take a look at the TSX here, down over 0.7%. It all started the night before on Tuesday. Alphabet came out with earnings. Here's a piece by the New York Times. It's a real puff piece. They overstretched it a little bit. Yes, Alphabet did beat their earnings expectations, but investors were still not happy. Tesla came out with weaker than expected earnings, and we saw Tesla drop big time the next day. If we take a look at the big movers on the day, we can see that Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia, this is the technology sector that was really getting hurt. And take a look here. Here's the technology sector down over 4% on the day. The positives, look at the utilities. So investors were rushing off to the defensive sectors. Consumer staples was just slightly negative, and healthcare was actually positive on the day. So there's a real rush into defensive sectors on the day. It'll be interesting to see if that continues. Here's the key though. We've got more earnings coming up shortly. Big earnings. This is Microsoft coming out on July 30th, so that's next Tuesday. This is really key for the markets overall. So far, investors haven't been that happy, and then we have to look at investor reaction. And it'll be interesting to see how investors respond to these earnings and how strong they are as well. And then on Thursday, we've got Amazon coming out and Apple as well. So we've got some really heavyweights coming out next week. And if these three companies really come out with strong earnings, that really could move the market higher. But if they're just mediocre, maybe we have a carry on from what we've seen today. So investors really going to be watching this. The big one that everybody's going to be watching for later on is on August 28th. We got Nvidia coming out with their earnings. And I got to tell you, I have some concerns overall for the Nasdaq. If we take a look at the Nasdaq relative to the S&P 500, we can see some concerning action here. Let's go to the big board and take a look. This top graph represents the Nasdaq. This graph represents the Nasdaq relative to the S&P 500. This is the graph I want to concentrate on. I want to take a look at the performance in the spring and summer months. Let's go back to 2022. Here we can see that the Nasdaq put in a bottom relative to the S&P 500 in the month of May. Then we saw that outperformance of 6%. And then we saw the Nasdaq correct down into the month of October. And then if we go forward with the Nasdaq here and we end up in 2023, this is when the AI hype really started to kick off. That was last April. Here you can see the Nasdaq outperforming the S&P 500 as the hype really took hold, and we saw that outperformance take place. And that was once again, that was another 6%, approximately 6% outperformance. And then we saw the Nasdaq peak here in the month of July, and we can see here that we saw on an absolute basis here, it went down once again into October. And then we saw on a relative basis, we saw that consolidation take place. Now we're in 2024, and you can see here in April, look what happened again. So what we saw was we saw a bottom take place in May, and then we saw a bottom take place in April. Now here we are in April, we've seen a bottom here, and we saw performance just over that 6% threshold once again. So we had 6% outperformance into the month of August and 6% outperformance into the month of July. And here we are in the month of July, and we can see here we've had that 6% outperformance, and now we've broken that relative upward trend line. I can't say the same pattern is going to happen again in 2024, but it definitely is something to track and monitor. And so far, it seems like we've got the pattern happening 3 times in a row.